Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Raimundo Rios Mayo Library in Arkanasa. Welcome to the show. Hope you all enjoyed our last episode. Tonight, we'll be talking about the moon. But first, if you're dying for a cup of coffee and you're planning on going down to the Organic Man coffee shop, don't go yet. They're currently in the process of moving to a new location. You won't be getting any coffee if you go down there, but they might put you to work moving things. Their new location will only be a block farther south and a block farther east from where they're at right now. They will be at 1002 Iturbide, suite number 7. But don't go yet, the coffee's not on. The moon. I've always wondered, how come our moon doesn't have a name? All the other moons had names. Some of them had really cool names, but our moon is just called the moon. Luna doesn't count because that means the moon. Got to doing some research. Found out that the reason our moon doesn't have a name is back when they first looked up and saw the moon there and said, yeah, we'll call that thing a moon. They didn't know there were any other moons out there, so they didn't know they'd have to differentiate from one to another. So they just called it the moon, which is something that the Germans had originally come up with. So we have the Germans to thank for our moon being called the moon, but I don't know who you'd say we need to give it a name. Definitely not some politician. I think we should name it after some famous comedic writer, Mark Twain or Terry Pratchett, perhaps. Since the moon doesn't have a name, that brought to mind, how come the earth doesn't have a name? We call it the earth, which is the same thing you call a bag of dirt. Once again, we have the Germans to thank. They had a word, Erde, which the term earth was derived from, which means ground or soil. So neither our moon or our planet was designated a name. We simply call it what we will and hope the aliens know what to call it. What do scientists tell us about the moon? Well, it's 238,855 miles from Earth. If you were to drive to San Antonio at 75 miles an hour, it would take you 2 hours to get there. Now let's say you decided to drive to the moon. At the same speed, 75 miles an hour, it would take you 4.5 months to get there. And that's not adding time for bathroom breaks and gassing up. 4.5 months of continuous driving. That's a long ways to go. Sounds kind of boring to me. Takes the moon 27.3 days to complete one of its orbital phases. The same side of the moon is always facing the Earth. If you go out in a field in China and look up at the moon, or you go out in the middle of South Africa and look up at the moon, you're always going to be looking at the same side, the same face. As the moon circles around the Earth, it's at a very slow rotation that just happens to coincide with the time it takes to circle the Earth. So no matter when, where you are, when you're looking up at the moon, you're seeing the same side. This is what led to the term the dark side of the moon. The dark side is the side that is always facing away from the Earth. So back before we had space travel, before we had satellites and exploring vehicles flying around, no one knew for sure what was on the other side of the moon. There were all kinds of theories, but nobody had an answer. Every night when the moon comes up, it will appear in the sky 43 minutes later than it did the night before. So if you look up at the moon and it's hanging there bright and white 10 o'clock at night, tomorrow night it would show at 10:43. Each night it will be 43 minutes later making its appearance. The moon is the exact right size so that when it comes between the Earth and the sun, it completely blocks out the sun. This is what leads to a solar eclipse. If the moon had been just a little bit smaller, it wouldn't have worked. The same goes for the moon and the sun. When the Earth comes between the sun and the moon, it's just the right size, just the right distance to totally block out the moon, leading to a lunar eclipse. Now for the things that make the moon kind of strange. The moon, according to scientists, is 4.6 billion years old. Some of the rocks that they brought back from the moon have been dated at 5.3 billion years old, which is kind of strange considering the Earth isn't nearly that old. According to scientists, the moon is older than the Earth, and the rocks on the moon are older than the moon. It gets even worse. The dust that you saw billowing up around the astronauts when they were walking on the moon, the dust is even older than the rocks. So scientists are really wondering, where did the dust come from that litters the surface of the moon? Why are the rocks so much older than the rest of the planet? And how is it that the moon, circling around the Earth, could be so much older than us? Gets even stranger. There are hefty gravitational anomalies found throughout the moon. Some of them are so bad that they actually affect the rotation of satellites and spacecraft as they orbited the moon. NASA had a hard time coming to terms with this. There was lots of swearing and lots of calculations made as the scientists tried to figure out how come these weird gravitational fields were affecting things rotating the moon. They have finally discovered that most of these gravitational anomalies are directly over the Mars found on the moon. Mar is a fancy word for ocean. Now, don't get too excited. There's not giant pools of water on the surface of the moon. They're simply called Mars because they had to call them something. 80% of these gravitational anomalies are on the side of the moon facing the Earth. That could possibly explain why it is that the same side of the moon is always facing us, but the scientists haven't a clue as to what is causing these weird gravitational anomalies. Since ancient time, full moons have been associated with odd or insane behavior, including sleepwalking, suicide, illegal activity, fits of violence, and of course transforming into werewolves. If you go back and look at the legends of werewolves, you'll discover the moon seldom had anything to do with the person becoming a wolf. One of the supposed recommended forms of transformation, you had to put on a belt that was put together by a warlock or a wizard, and the belt had to be made out of human flesh, and this would cause you to turn into a werewolf. Another recommended way of transformation was a salve that you would acquire from a witch that you would smear all over your body, and this was supposed to turn you into a werewolf. Most of the legends, most of the history that I could find when dealing with werewolves, very seldom did they say the full moon. Most of the time it was some other means. We will be right back after these brief commercial messages. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Looking for a great cup of coffee? The Organic Man Coffee Shop at 1108 Lincoln, downtown Laredo, Texas. Serving only the best organic coffee in the world. Not a coffee person? They have hot chocolate, hot tea, and iced drinks if that's your drink of choice. The Organic Man Coffee Shop, 1108 Lincoln, downtown Laredo, just a half block west of the Mercado. Remember, folks, don't go rushing down there yet. They're in the process of moving to their new location, and they will be announcing their grand reopening shortly.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arkanasa Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arkanasa Radio.
You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Welcome back. Hope you enjoyed those brief messages. As I had said a moment ago, they believed that the full moon would cause all kinds of bizarre behavior in people. Now, the skeptics and the scientists will tell you that there's no such thing. The full moon doesn't really affect people. The scientists and the skeptics have never worked in the emergency room on a full moon. I used to be a paramedic. I spent many a long night working in the emergency room as well as taking people to the emergency room. A full moon definitely has an effect on people. You would see some of the most bizarre behavior in situations like that. In the British Isles, the British Police Department has seen fit to put on extra manpower on nights when there's a full moon. 18th century England, people on trial for murder could plead to receive a latent sentence if it had been an occurrence on a full moon. The term lunatic came about because of the effects of the moon on people's brains. Lots of people had been locked up in insane asylums and other places claiming that the moon was having an effect on them. In 1820, the Bavarian astronomer Franz von Paula claimed to have seen cities on the moon through his telescope. He had observed what he thought were cities, roads running between the cities, huge agricultural plots of land, all scattered about the surface of the moon. He said there were forts, roads, and other things of interest. That was in 1820. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, written by Robert Louis Stevens. Robert Louis Stevens was actually inspired by a man named Charles Hyde, who was living in London and had committed some serious crimes during nights of the full moon. I tried to investigate this to see if I could find out what these crimes were, but unfortunately there are so many people named Charles Hyde who lived in London, I could never quite find out what these crimes were. But considering the book and the movie, they must not have been too nice. In some Chinese religions, offerings are made to ancestors on the night of a full moon. The light from a full moon is believed to be a good time for divination and scrying. That's scrying with an S. How do you go about scrying? Well, if you read my book, The Bag Company Goes Squatching, on page 53, it says you don't stare into a mirror to do scrying. You look at it at an angle. You try to see what's there but not there. Get it? Anyway, scrying. How do you do scrying using the full moon? To begin with, you need a good stable surface to set your dish on. You don't want anything that will wiggle or wobble while you're looking at it, because this will affect your ability to scry. You fill a plate, a bowl, with water right up to the surface. You leave it sitting in the middle of the table. Then you position yourself at an angle so you can look across the surface of the water and see the reflection of the moon. Once you've got that accomplished, you allow your vision to perceive things that you couldn't normally see. Thoughts may enter your mind. You may suddenly hear a voice whispering in the back of your brain, telling you things. This is kind of how Nostradamus did his famous visions into the future. He was a scryer. That was his means of seeing all the things that he has been credited with seeing, things that a lot of people say have been happening. For many pagans are those who believe in more than one god. Many pagans believe that the cycles of the moon are very important for magical workings. It depends if the moon is waxing, if it's waning, if it's a full moon. All these situations lead to different rituals that will accomplish different feats. A waxing moon is when it's filling up, and a waning moon is when it's disappearing. Funny thing, tonight there should be no moon because we're talking about it now, but it's going to be a pretty dark night. President Kennedy and the moon. 1957, the Soviets sent a small satellite into orbit around the Earth. All it did was beep. But back then, that was a huge accomplishment. It kind of freaked out everybody here in the United States. Massive fallout shelters were being built in people's backyards. People were panicking, thinking, great, now the Russians can drop bombs on our heads from outer space. People were not happy to see that the Russians had beat the United States into such an endeavor. So in 1961, shortly after becoming President of the United States, John F. Kennedy announced that he was determined to win the space race. He was going to show the Soviets that the United States could outdo them when it came to things circling the Earth. Kennedy then upped the ante in 1961 when he announced the United States was going to put a man on the moon. They would deliver a man to the moon and then bring him back safely to the Earth. That second part was very important. You don't want to just send somebody up there and leave them. Nobody's going to like that, especially the astronaut. Well, the cost of all those rockets and spacesuits and sending things into outer space as experiments was beginning to pile up. The U.S. was spending far too much money on this program. The USSR, they were right behind the U.S. They were spending more money on the space program than just about anything else. It got to a point where the two countries were literally on the verge of bankrupting themselves trying to get somebody to the moon. That's when Kennedy came up with his unique idea. Kennedy announced that the United States and the Soviet space program should combine. They should run the two together. There was no reason why the United States and Russia could not become allies once again. After all, they had fought together in a means of defeating the Nazis during World War II. And Kennedy invited the Soviet Union to join the United States and have one space program between the two countries. The Russians were actually interested in the idea. They thought, why not? We could combine the two, send somebody to the moon, and save a little money on at the same time. It's not as if the Soviet scientists and the American scientists didn't have a whole lot in common. The scientists working on the space program here in the United States were just about all from Germany. The scientists in Russia working on the space program were just about all from Germany as well. At the end of World War II, the Allies were in the position to round up hundreds of German scientists and find out what they'd been working on, since the Germans were far in advance with rocketry. Well, the Russians also had rounded up hundreds of thousands of scientists. And the Russians took the German scientists back to Russia, and eventually the United States brought the German scientists to the United States. And then our Germans and their Germans were competing with each other to see who could get to the moon quickest. To make things just a little more bizarre, the scientists were constantly sending messages back and forth, letters, and they would write to the scientists in Russia because, hey, they'd all worked together in Germany. And then the Russian scientists would write letters and they'd send them back to the United States. So there really weren't a whole lot of secrets between our space agency and the Russians. After all, the people running them, well, they were blabbing back and forth about everything they were doing. How did all those German scientists get into the United States in the first place? Well, there's a little something called Operation Paperclip. Operation Paperclip was a means of the American government bringing scientists from Germany to the United States. Had to call it something, so they called it Paperclip. Perhaps that had something to do with the fact that the German scientists, instead of having their paperwork stuck together with staples like they're supposed to be, they were sticking pages in there using paper clips because the records of these scientists were being written as they were being brought to the United States. There were lots of inappropriate things going on at the time, but they kept saying it's for the good of our country. On page 277 of the book Dark Mission by Richard C. Hoagland, there's a picture of the German scientists here in the United States. They're all standing on the porch of a bar out at the White Sands Missile Proving Grounds. You look at the sign hanging over these men's heads, and you'll see a swastika right in the middle of the sign. All of these men were Nazis at one time. And here they were in the United States being protected by the very men who at one time had been fighting them. And these were the men that were going to put us on the moon. Getting back to the idea of the United States and the Soviets working together, consider this. Instead of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landing on the moon and taking that one giant leap for mankind, it could have been Neil Armstrong and Yuri Gagarin landing on the moon. And just how were they going to decide who would get off the spaceship first? I could see a potential fistfight inside the lunar module. Unfortunately, just 2 months after announcing the plan to combine the United States and Soviet Union's space program, John Kennedy lost his mind in Dallas. We'll be going over that in more detail on July 9th. The Eagle has landed. Those famous words announced by Neil Armstrong when the lunar landing module set down on the face of the moon in 1969. I remember that day fairly well. I was quite young at the time, but there are certain things that happen in your life that you just never forget. It was on all the news broadcasts. It was on the radio. They pulled us out of school to watch it. Well, they didn't pull us out of the school. They pulled us out of class. We had one TV set. They set it at one end of the hallway, and everybody lined up in the hallway and watched it as it happened. After raising the American flag, gathering some moon rocks, taking some photographs, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin clomb back into the lunar module, getting ready to leave the moon and come back to the Earth. And as they're moving about the spacecraft, taking off their space suits that they had to wear while on the moon, one of them looked down and noticed there was a broken switch laying on the floor. They got to looking at this broken switch, and they tracked it back to its original location. They discovered that the button that would be used to fire the retro engines, the jet engines that would get them off the moon, was broken. Of all the switches to hit with some item, they don't know who did it, they don't know how it happened, but of all the things to break, the one button that was going to put them back on the Earth was broken. The scientists here on the Earth, while communicating with the astronauts on the moon, told the Buzz Armstrong and Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, why don't y'all go to sleep while we try and figure this out? I don't think I'd be able to sleep knowing that we just might not be leaving the moon. However, that's what the NASA scientists told our astronauts. Well, eventually, Buzz Aldrin, he couldn't sleep, and he'd had enough of the NASA scientists telling him how they're going to hopefully save his life. He pulled a pen out of his pocket, took the barrel out of the pen, shoved the part of the pen into the little hole where the switch was supposed to be, and when he flipped the pen up, surprisingly, the rocket engines came on and the lunar module left the surface of the moon. So Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong's lives were literally saved by a cheap ballpoint pen. As they were leaving the surface of the moon, the blast from the rocket engine, Buzz Aldrin looked out the window just in time to see the American flag go whisking off away from the spacecraft. The rocket engine had blasted the flag away from the lunar module, so none of the ceremony that they had performed at the beginning of the space landing, no flag, nothing there. But they did manage to come back to the planet safe and sound. As the Apollo 11 team arrived safely on the Earth, they were picked up, transported to Hawaii. When they got to Hawaii, one of the first things the three men had to do was fill out some forms for the government. The customs agent met them and said, you need to declare anything you brought back with you. So here's Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, and the third man that nobody can remember his name because he stayed in the command module. Here they are filling out forms telling the bureaucrats, we've been to the moon, we brought back some moon rocks, none of us are illegal aliens. Please let us back in the country. No matter what you do, you cannot escape the bureaucrats. We'll be back after these brief messages. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Looking for a great cup of coffee? The Organic Man Coffee Shop at 1108 Lincoln, downtown Laredo, Texas. Serving only the best organic coffee in the world. Not a coffee person? They have hot chocolate, hot tea, and iced drinks if that's your drink of choice. The Organic Man Coffee Shop, 1108 Lincoln, downtown Laredo, just a half block west of the Mercado.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arcanelza Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arcanelza Radio.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. Welcome back. Years later, retired astronaut Buzz Aldrin revealed that everything they said, everything that you saw on TV, everything you heard on the radio, it was all a script. The NASA scientists had prepared every word that the astronauts were to say. When Mission Control was talking to the astronauts on the radio, everything Mission Control had to say was also scripted. None of it was their own words. None of it was their own thoughts. So when they're talking about the beautiful view of the Earth or how the moon looked, it had all been written out by some guy sitting at a desk at Johnson Space Center. I believe we went to the moon. However, a lot of the photographs that you see were doctored. Long before there was Photoshop, there was a black felt marker. Anything that showed up on the photographs that the scientists at NASA thought we weren't big enough, old enough, intelligent enough to look at, they'd simply black out with a pen, and then they would print the photograph so that the new photograph was missing whatever it was that they didn't think we should see. They were constantly touching things up, making things go away, but every once in a while something would slip through. It's very well known that NASA had some giant sound stages set up with things that looked like the surface of the moon, and they had the lunar module, and they had people prancing around looking like they're on the moon. I still believe that we did land on the moon. I used to live 2 blocks from Johnson Space Center. But at the same time, a lot of what we saw on TV, a lot of what we heard on the radio, a lot of it was made up by NASA. Just remember what Richard C. Hoagland says NASA means. NASA means never a straight answer. 12 Americans have walked on the moon. Only 3 men have visited the bottom of the ocean. The Challenger Deep, which is nearly 7 miles down. It is so deep that no light gets down there. Back in 1960, 2 men, Jacques Piccard and Lieutenant Don Walsh, went down to the bottom of the Challenger Deep in a submersible called the Trieste. Now, the Trieste was just a giant balloon filled with gasoline, because if they'd filled it with air, the pressure at the bottom of the ocean would have collapsed the thing. And then they had ballast on this device, so that when they got to the bottom of the ocean, they could pull a lever, and a hatch would open up, and the ballast would fall out, and hopefully the Trieste would come back to the surface. It had never been successfully tested because it had never been to the bottom of the ocean until that time. January 23rd, 1960, those 2 men successfully went to the bottom of the ocean. And who remembers their names today? Unfortunately, very few. Jacques Piccard's father was also renowned for having gone to the highest elevation in a balloon twice. So his father went to the top of the earth, the son went to the bottom. March 26, 2012, James Cameron, the man who made the Titanic famous, joined Piccard and Walsh as being one of the 3 men to ever visit the bottom of the ocean. A lot of fanfare was made for the astronauts, but not very much about the men going to the bottom of the ocean. It seems as if we know more about the moon than we know about the bottom of our own planet. Have you looked at that grainy mess that came out on TV when Neil Armstrong jumped off of the lunar module and made that famous statement? It did not look very impressive. Even when I was young and sitting there in the hallway at the school watching it on TV, it really wasn't very impressive. I kept thinking, why did they use such a cheap camera? Why couldn't they have done a better job? After all, you watch Star Trek, you watch these different shows on TV, then you get a chance to actually watch a real live space mission, and it looks crappy. Well, they actually had a very good camera mounted on the landing leg of the LEM, directed towards the ladder, so that when Neil Armstrong came down, they would get him in action. It was a very good camera. Trouble is, back then they had no way of transmitting from the moon to a TV set. Since they couldn't transmit the thing, they didn't have any way of showing what was going on to the TV audience. So what NASA did, rocket scientists, they had a little tiny TV monitor where the image of the moon was being sent from space. They took a TV camera and they set it right in front of that little bitty monitor, and then they transmitted what the camera was seeing to the viewing audience. So that's why the movie of the first landing on the moon just doesn't look very sharp. It was transmitted from the moon to NASA, sharp as could be, and then it was transferred from NASA to the airwaves by whatever means possible. Back then, the scientists didn't really think very highly of the taxpayers that were paying all their bills, and to this day, I still don't think they take us very serious. They also had 2 Hasselblad cameras. Neil Armstrong had one and Buzz Aldrin had one. The reason they used this particular kind of camera, it was the easiest one to use while wearing a spacesuit. With those great big bulky gloves and with that helmet on, they couldn't use a normal camera. There was no way of triggering it. So the scientists, by trial and error, had determined that the best thing to use was the Hasselblads. That's the kind of camera that you hold out in front of you and you look down and you see what you're taking a photograph of. They took hundreds of photographs, and then NASA went through and changed a lot of what they had taken pictures of. And where is that world-famous film today of Neil Armstrong, the first person from the planet Earth to ever set foot on another planet? Well, unfortunately, some guy at NASA, some desk jockey, decided we don't need that film after all, and they taped over it. The most important historical event possibly to take place in this entire century, and they filmed over it. This would be the equivalent of Roger Patterson recording cartoons over his historic Bigfoot images of Patty. Fortunately for the rest of the planet, Australia still has their copy of the film transmitted from the moon. So the Australian scientists were good enough to allow the NASA scientists to borrow their footage. But if not for the people in Australia, we wouldn't have any footage of that historical event. Even though all the conversations between the astronauts and the Earth were pre-scripted, on occasion they would find a reason to turn off the transmitters and they would just talk amongst themselves. Or the astronauts would turn off the scientists at NASA would turn off the feed so that they could talk to the people in the space capsule without the rest of us listening in. Some of the conversations that they had were devastating. If we had heard this at the time, who knows what people on this planet might have been thinking. It took years before the transcripts of the conversations were released to the public, and I don't think they were released on purpose. I think somebody did it because they might have been upset with somebody. One of the conversations, the commander of the spacecraft is speaking. It's kind of hard to understand everything he says, but his voice, as it was transcribed, he's saying, "Yes, it is. Vegetation. Something is common reference, familiar reference. So you don't know how far above you are. So it makes look like a scale is," and then the pilot is heard saying, "flowed into that little domicile structure before the domes were built, or else all that stuff that's in the Mar floor has flown out of that domicile structure before the domes came in." Then you hear Mission Control talking. What's there? Then it's garbled. Mission Control calling Apollo 11. Then Apollo 11 is answering. "These babies were huge, sir. Enormous. Oh, God, you wouldn't believe it. I'm telling you there are other spacecraft out there lined up on the far side of the crater edge. They're on the moon watching us." He said there are other spacecraft out there. This was Apollo 11 speaking to ground control. What exactly were they looking at? Don't wait for NASA to tell you. Remember, never a straight answer. Apollo 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17 all successfully landed on the moon. Whatever happened to Apollo 18, 19, and 20? Why were they scrapped? After the final landing on the moon, Apollo 17, on December 11th, 1972, NASA had decided, we've been there enough. We've got enough rocks. We've spent enough money. We're not going to go back. We're just going to call it quits because, we've been there, done that. Oh, well. The rocket, the Saturn V, was ready to go. It was fueled up. Apollo 18, all they had to do was push a button and send it off into outer space. It wouldn't have cost them any more money than they'd already spent. The money was spent, the rocket's ready, the crew is ready. Let's send them to the moon. Let's not. I'm very curious as to what exactly had happened that caused NASA to suddenly just abandon all plans of going back to the moon 3 more times. Was it something someone said, perhaps? Perhaps they were warned off by someone already on the moon? Could there have been some alien inhabitants up there that said, "Look, you guys keep coming up here dropping all your trash on the ground, quit it"? Or maybe they said, "The moon is ours and y'all can't have it." We may never know, unless, for some reason, the people at NASA decide to come clean and tell us exactly what was going on. All the rockets, all the spacecraft were built for 20 trips to the moon. Today, 3 of them are just sitting there collecting rust. Some of the most expensive museum pieces ever constructed. Since when has our government ever considered saving money? Oh, yes, the winning bid was always the lowest bid, but then there were always cost overruns. There are always budget crises. There are always reasons to spend more money than had been originally budgeted. I can remember being in the Army. We would replace a light bulb on a tank. The light bulb would cost $28. Or we could run down to Hilo and buy it for $1.98. It was the exact same bulb as went in the back end of a 1968 Chevy pickup. Same bulb, just a slightly different price tag. Despite being a dead hunk of rock with little geological activity, scientists have been recording moonquakes. Kind of like what you see in California, an earthquake, except on the moon. Now here on the Earth, earthquakes are caused by the tectonic plates rubbing together. When one of them rubs up against the other one, it causes an earthquake. According to scientists, there are no tectonic plates on the moon. If there aren't any tectonic plates, then what's causing the moonquakes? Scientists have no idea. They've been studying it for years, and they still can't tell us exactly what it is that's causing these moonquakes to go off every once in a while. Most people think the moon is, well, a moon. But there are those out there that will tell you it's too big. The moon should actually be another planet. It's 1.5 times bigger than Pluto. Of course, I know Pluto is no longer a planet. Thing is, they never asked me to vote on that. I think Pluto should still be a planet. But then, I have a lot of thoughts that nobody pays any attention to. Because of the large size, the moon doesn't actually orbit the Earth at all. The Earth and the moon actually orbit each other. There's a point between the Earth and the moon that the rotation is actually occurring. It's called a barycenter. The barycenter is the point where the gravitational pull of the two bodies affect each other. At this moment, the barycenter is actually beneath the Earth's surface. If it had been just a few miles farther, it would have caused the moon to actually be declared as a planet. As the moon goes around the Earth is actually going around the moon as well. It's hard to describe, but trust me, the Earth is rotating around the moon as much as the moon is rotating around the Earth. "95% illuminated moon appears half as bright as a full moon." That's kind of hard to get your mind around. You would think that a moon that is 95% there would be 95% illuminated, but it's not. It's only half as bright as when there's a full moon. The Earth, when seen from the moon, goes through phases just like the moon does. So if you're standing on the surface of the moon and you look up and see the Earth, it might be a crescent Earth, it might be a half Earth, or you could say, oh, look, it's a full Earth. The moon encompasses a huge temperature range. Temperatures can vary from 280 degrees Fahrenheit in the daytime to 260 degrees below zero at night. That's quite a jump in temperature. If you go to the bottom of some of the craters that never see the light of the sun, the temperature can be as much as 400 degrees below freezing. One thing that surprises astronauts who visited the moon was the strong odor that they encountered. Now, they wouldn't smell anything while they're walking around on the moon because they're inside a spacesuit. Once they got back on the lunar landing module, started to take their suits off, that's when they started to detect this weird aroma. Neil Armstrong said that it smelled like burnt ashes from a fireplace. Other astronauts said it smelled like burnt gunpowder. They don't know what causes this weird smell. They just know that everyone that's been to the moon has sworn that they can smell it. So what happened on the moon that caused us to not go back? Could it have been aliens on the moon? Could it have been alien or ancient artifacts on the moon? Richard C. Hoagland, in his book Dark Mission, said that NASA had found things on the moon that those in charge thought we just couldn't handle. What kind of things? Well, there's a photograph from space showing a lunar landscape, and it has this bizarre anomaly on it, which Mr. Hoagland calls the shard or the tower. If you type in shard on the moon, you'll see an image. It's a bizarre-looking thing, almost looks like a bowling pin sticking up on the side of the moon. Now, this bowling pin would be 1.5 miles tall, and according to Mr. Hoagland, it would be guesstimated at being several billion years old. Because it has been there for a long time without anybody doing any kind of maintenance on it, it's kind of beat up, been hit by a few meteorites, been crashed into by various things, but you can see it. You just type in shard or tower on the moon, and you'll see it. It looks very bizarre. And then there's the thing called the castle. If you look at it, it is a very strange-looking structure. It's square. If you look close, you can see what looked like little ornamentation along the sides of it. Mr. Hoagland refers to it as the castle, and you could swear you can see columns along the sides of the wall. Right in the center is a very high spire. Looks almost like the top of a church. What these things are, the NASA scientists may very well know. After all, they have sent so many missions up there and looked at these things. Unfortunately, they're not going to tell us what they are. They're going to keep it to themselves. One of the films taken while circling the moon was of something that they call the Fast Walker. The Fast Walker was a dark shape that as the spacecraft is circling the moon, you can see this dark image traveling from one point to another. It is traveling hundreds of miles on the video footage. The NASA scientists can't tell us what it was. We just know that it was there. We'll be right back after these brief messages. You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Looking for a great cup of coffee? The Organic Man Coffee Shop at 1108 Lincoln, downtown Laredo, Texas. Serving only the best organic coffee in the world. Not a coffee person? They have hot chocolate, hot tea, and iced drinks if that's your drink of choice. The Organic Man Coffee Shop, 1108 Lincoln, downtown Laredo, just a half block west of the Mercado.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arcanesa Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arcanesa Radio.
You're listening to Arcanesa Radio. Welcome back. Could the moon be hollow? November 20th, 1969, Apollo 12 crashed their landing module into the moon. Scientific experiment. The moon rang like a bell for over an hour. Now the scientists immediately rushed out and claimed that this was the sound waves passing through the moon's core. But if you take a bell and you pack it full of sand and you hit it with a hammer, it's not going to ring like a bell. It's just going to make a dull thud. But it rang like a bell. On another occasion, they took a piece of the Saturn spacecraft and they slammed it into the side of the moon, which caused the moon to ring for several hours. The NASA scientists couldn't explain what was happening, but they sure did try. Now, there are some really strange things about NASA, the organization itself. One of the top scientists, a guy named John Whiteside Parsons. He was born Marvel Parsons, October 2nd, 1914, but he was better known as Jack Parsons. He was a rocket scientist. In fact, he's the man that came up with the idea for the J-2 rocket assist launch mechanism for airplanes. Jack Parsons was a rocket scientist, a chemist, an inventor, businessman, writer, socialite, and Thelemite occultist. Thelema is a religion based on a philosophical law of the same name. The law says, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." In other words, do whatever you want, it doesn't matter. Thelema was created by a character named Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley was a self-proclaimed most evil man on the planet. Another individual named Anton LaVey, who studied under Aleister Crowley, was the founder of the Church of Satan. Now, these are the guys that are putting NASA together. Kind of makes you wonder. Jack Parsons was associated with the California Institute of Technology, Caltech. He was also a principal founder of Jet Propulsion Laboratories. JPL is a part of NASA. What kind of bizarre goings-on was happening out there in the desert when they weren't building rockets? Parsons and his cohort, an individual named Cameron, were trying to perform a magical action called the Barbalon working. The reason for this magical ritual, they were trying to produce something called a homunculus. A homunculus is a soulless being that is brought about to do the bidding of its master, kind of like a slave that will do anything you tell it to. A slave that has no soul, it has no conscience. Its only reason for existing is to do what you tell it to. Parsons referred to this creature that he was trying to bring to life as the Moonchild. It was so frightening that when Aleister Crowley found out that Parsons was trying to create this Moonchild, he actually tried to stop him. There was quite a battle of wits going on between Parsons and Crowley. But Parsons somehow managed to blow himself up using a J-2 rocket out in the desert. He ceased to exist on June 17th, 1952, as far as we know. But whether or not anyone helped him leave this planet, we may never know. If you like the idea of the homunculus and you want to hear some more about it, there's a podcast called The Expanded Perspectives, well worth listening to. And on May 6th, 2016, they did a show about the homunculus. If I were interested in it, I would definitely give them a listen. Now then there was the head of NASA itself, Wernher von Braun. He considered Parsons to be one of the most important pioneers in rocket age. Wernher von Braun was an SS major. He wasn't just some underling like he tried to portray himself. When he was at Penemundo, they used slave labor to build most of the rockets. The slaves were not well treated. These were the men and women from the concentration camps. Von Braun was actually known to go to some of the concentration camps to look for suitable people to do his bidding. Werner von Braun was a close friend of the one and only Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, the man responsible for the death camps. You're known by the people you hang out with. Werner von Braun was hanging out with some pretty dastardly individuals. Von Braun diligently developed the Nazi V weapons. V was for vengeance. They were trying to convince the people of Germany that they were only doing this as a means of getting back at the British for the things that they had done. So that's why they're called V weapons. Werner von Braun was very instrumental in a lot of the destruction that took place in and around London. At the end of World War II, when the scientists were being rounded up by both the U.S. and the USSR, President Truman gave an order. Only scientists with no Nazi affiliation were eligible for Operation Paperclip. A man named Allen Dulles had the scientists' dossiers rewritten. He pulled out all the parts that said anything about SS affiliation so that they could get these men into the United States. Allen Dulles is the same man that Kennedy fired from the CIA because of the screw-up that took place in the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. Then later, once Kennedy had been murdered in Dallas, Allen Dulles was put in charge of trying to find out who did it. Now, does it make a lot of sense to have the man looking into a murder who really didn't much care for the person who was murdered? Well, you might argue that without Werner von Braun, we'd have never reached the moon. But if you've seen the movie Bedeviled, when you make deals with the devil, you always lose. Werner von Braun was just one man looking to get to the moon. I'm sure we could have done it without dealing with the Nazis. We kind of, as a country, sold our souls there when dealing with these men. Hope you've enjoyed tonight's show about the moon. It's a fascinating subject if you dig deep enough. If you get a chance, read the book Dark Mission by Richard C. Hoagland. It's an eye-opener. Next week, I hope Nick Redfern will be with us. He'll be discussing his latest book, Men in Black. Tune in next Saturday at 5 o'clock, and we'll be back then to entertain you, enlighten you, and hopefully keep you awake at night. Until then, later. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, the same murder 3? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?